Hello, everybody. Welcome to week one. So as I mentioned in the welcome video, which if you have not watched it all, go back and watch it all. It'll help set up this whole semester. I explained that each Monday for the classes at 8 a.m. I will send out an announcement, and then you will watch it. It will set up the context for the week and go over some of the basic materials. And then somewhere in this video is going to be a question that I'm going to ask you that you're going to have to reply to this announcement. You actually reply to the announcement with the answer to that. And so I'm going to be thinking while I'm talking about what question I'm going to ask you. Usually it's related to the materials, but since we're just getting going and I've got other questions about other things, we'll see what I come up with. So this week, you're going to have 5 modules to go through. Actually, each week you'll have 5 modules. And however, this week there's also the welcome, and then there's the introductory materials. I do recommend going through all of that. There's some great materials in there on if you're ready for college and what to expect and all of those things. It's good to know the policies of the college, everything, all of that is in there. Of course, all the welcome material, because you're going to want that syllabus and you're going to want the assignments. And you are going to see the due dates on the right. One thing, again, is it's really important to understand with our discussions, you're going to have a Thursday due date for your initial post. That'll be Thursday at noon. And then I guess Thursday by the end of the day is when I do that one. It's the announcements that are due Thursday at noon. So by the end of the day on Thursday, I want your initial post, and then you have till Sunday night, the following Sunday night, to do your replies. And I do that so that I keep everything moving. If I let everybody wait, what happens is that nobody's getting to it in time, and it's not really functioning organically the way that it should. So you'll have gone through all of that material. You can see it. You'll see it in Canvas over on the right-hand side, the upcoming due dates. So it's really good to keep track of that. Set your settings so that it tells you what you need to know. Do whatever things you need to do to keep on top of all the work. So this week, we're going to have an orientation module, and then you're going to go through chapters 1, 2, 3, and 4 in the book. And as I mentioned in the welcome video, and I've mentioned in the letter, this class is very closely connected to the book, so it's important that you have it and you go through it. Again, make sure you get your Spotify set up and all of that good stuff too. So the orientation serves 2 functions. First of all, it's to get us all on the same level playing field in terms of what it means to take online classes. Now, I know that most everybody's been doing that because of the pandemic, and so I still, a lot of people got thrown into that, and maybe it wasn't quite set up right. So this way, we're all good when we're learning about how to act on online classes, particularly because we do have discussions and aspects like that. There's going to be other assignments that you need to read through that you're going to be asked about in terms of online materials and all sorts of good stuff. Take the time and go through them. It's really worth it. Even if it's just a refresher, it's worth it. And then you're also going to learn about neural nostalgia. And that is basically the power of music and sounds to connect to our memory. And so one of the things that I want you to be mindful of, that you'll read an article about this and watch a little video about it, is that for all of us, our favorite music will typically be the music that we grew up with from roughly the ages of 12 to 18, 12 to 20. I think the article has it a little bit different, but you'll see it in there. And there's reasons for that. There's physiological reasons, there's emotional reasons, there's psychological reasons, there's behavioral reasons to why that music will always be our favorite music. And it will be, and I used to go into these lectures about it, and I found these great materials. So it helps to understand that when you're going into a class like this, because we're going to go back farther to the beginnings of a lot of American pop music, and then eventually we'll get to it globally. And so it's always good to understand in terms of, your favorite stuff. Sometimes people come into a class like this a little tentative or hesitant, or even maybe a little resistant to learning all the other styles of music. And I just want to learn about what I want to learn about. But the idea is learning all of this in a historical context. And then how do we get to where the music is that is your favorite music? And for a lot of you, especially if you're younger, we may not even be covering much of that in class, but You may be connected a lot to the music your parents listen to, or grandparents, and so those things will show up, or other family members or friends. So I want you to learn about that. You're going to be asked about that. There's going to be questions related to neuronostalgia as well. And then you're going to have a discussion. I know I mentioned in the video that this discussion groups will be broken up into, I think I'm going with 4 groups. This time is what I'm leaning towards. And but it's not going to be the case for this first discussion, because I want everybody to read through all of the stuff. You get to know each other a little bit better and be thinking about posting a picture, and there's an extra credit for updating Canvas. There's also thinking about your favorite band, artist, whatever, and why they're that way. And really, I want you to write thoughtfully and meaningful about it. Think about why that particular band or artist is your favorite. And then think about as you reply to other people. So I want engagement here, okay? And then you're going to have a reflection observation that's going to be different, but along similar lines. As we get more into the ones for next week, for the last 3 weeks, they will be very directly related to the materials that you're learning. So you're going to have the orientation module, and then you're going to go through chapters 1 through 4. A lot of very important material. Some of these modules are longer than others. You'll see that. Some of these videos are longer than others. Some of the videos that I've found, which are really cool, some of them are like an hour long. Take it for what it's worth. Some are short, some are long. If you've got the time, I recommend it. I really do recommend, once you start going into the materials, that you listen to the Spotify playlist, so that you get the sounds, you get the music in your head, in your ears, and you get the context of it. Watch the videos. But if you run across the documentary that I've found or whatever, and it's maybe an hour long, I'll let you make the call. I put them there because they're good. So it's great material, and I highly recommend it, but I'll let you decide what you want to do with that. So we're going to start with the roots of rock and roll, and you're going to learn about Tin Pan Alley. You're going to learn about jazz. You're going to learn about ragtime. I just gave this to you out of chronological order. You're going to learn a bit about swing, and we're going to get into the blues. And so it's important in the context to understand with this class is that what we're talking about is the blending of African cultures and European cultures. And of course, the European cultures, came over here. And every culture brings their music with them, to one degree or another. And so what you have with the European cultures is you have influences coming over primarily from places like England, Ireland, Scotland, but eventually it expands. But that's really the foundation of a lot of the music that we listen to. And then of course you have African music, and that music, of course, was brought here by way of slavery. And so that is a whole deep history. It's important to understand. And obviously, if you've been paying attention, to things over the last year or two, you realize that it's every bit as present as it has always been. These are struggles. And I wish that I could say that they began with this, but they didn't begin with this. They literally go back thousands of years. Sometimes people do awful things to other people, and it's really terrible. And so that plays a factor here. The slave trade, where these slaves were sold and stolen from their homeland, primarily in West Africa. There was slavery prior to this. There was slavery, if you look into the history of Europe and the expansion of Islam, and you look at all of those things, there was slavery, and a lot of that came from North Africa. And when we think about a lot of the slavery that we are connected to, it is coming from West Africa, and the slave trades would go basically a lot to South America, and the largest number of slaves were actually brought to Brazil, and then they were continued to be transported, again, horribly. This is just like an awful blight. I wish it was just a blight on American history, but the reality is it's just a blight on world history. And again, this literally, there is something about human nature and power that just creates very evil situations. I'd love to say that we are better than that we don't do it now. And while we don't have the horrible reality of what those poor people had to deal with through the slave trade when they were, sold from their homes and stolen from their homes in Africa and brought through to South America and up through the Caribbean and into places like Cuba and Jamaica and the island of Hispaniola, which is half of Haiti and the Dominican Republic, and then of course into the primarily the American South. And this was really, when you look at these slave trades too, it's important to understand, and I think that this gets lost a lot nowadays, was that when people talk about Americans and slavery, all of this started before America was a country. And so really what you're talking about is British slavery, Dutch slavery, and the slave trades that came through prior to the foundation of that. And then, of course, it was perpetuated into and transitioned into when we declared our independence and the United States did became free from British rule, and then the colonies became states, and the rest is history. So those of you that didn't pay attention in history class and are like, when am I ever going to learn about history again? It never goes away. We're always dealing with it. We're always having to look back on it. And this is why it's important to learn it, and it's important to understand it. There's the very well-known saying that those who don't learn history are doomed to repeat it. And you can see why. So it's important to understand these things. So what happened was these slaves that made their way, those that made their way to the South, that were put on plantations, that were forced to work, and they actually, for the most part, and most of the time, they weren't even allowed to continue the culture that they originally had. There was some things that were allowed in New Orleans and Congo Square, and that if you study the history of jazz, and it talks about it a little bit, you'll learn a little bit in this class about it. So there was some, but what happened was a lot of the slaves that were here were then hearing the music of European harmonies. What we carried over more from Africa was a lot of the rhythm, because a lot of the music from West Africa is more rhythmic than it is melodic, and very percussive. And so they blended together, and that really forms the roots of what will become rock and roll. So you have this trajectory that comes out of ragtime and blues, and these really happened simultaneously. And a lot of this music has an oral background, meaning it was transferred by ear, not by writing. So it wasn't really until we got to recorded music that we are able to document things more, or printed music in the case of things like ragtime. Scott Joplin sold over 1 million copies of Maple Leaf Rag in 1899. And so when we had printed music, and the roots of our popular music goes to printed music, and that's why we still talk about music publishing, even modern day, when most music is not ever printed. So it's important to understand that, okay, for all time, up until maybe about 140 years ago, all music was live, and you either played it or you heard it played live. In the late 1800s, they began to develop recordings, and then it wasn't until they started off with wax cylinders and wax discs. Then they ended up with using shellac and using 78s, and I'll do a little bit of a show and tell here. I don't know if this one's broken or not. These things are very fragile. Yeah, you can see this actually is broken. So this is a 78, and these old 78s, they're very thick. They're called 78s because they play at 78 RPM. They're very fragile. Shellac actually comes from beetles, not the band, but insects. And so these things are very fragile. This thing's probably, I don't know that it's 100 years old, but it's old. And so we had 78s. Those eventually took over from the wax cylinders and the wax discs. And then in 1948 is when 45s came out. And so I'll show you, if you're familiar nowadays, everybody calls these things vinyls. Vinyl is the material that they're made out of, so they stopped using shellac. This is a 45. 45 has two sides. one song on each side. This is actually the very first 45 that I ever bought myself when I was a little kid, which was the song Rock Around the Clock by Bill Haley and the Comets. The reason I became aware of it is because it was used for the first year as the theme song for the TV show Happy Days, which took place in the 50s. But this song is very important, Rock Around the Clock. And then later on, we have LPs, which is what y'all call the vinyls. And I picked this one because it's Jerry Lee Lewis. And so an LP, which is a long play, 45 is called a 45 because it rotates at 45 rotations per second. And then an LP, this is on Sun Records. You're going to learn about Sun Records. These are at 33 and a third RPM, so revolutions per second, per minute. So it revolves slower. And this is a collection of songs, and that's why they called them albums. They are also made out of vinyl, and that's why all you youngsters call them vinyls. But that's the material that it's made of. That's what that actually is. Those, by the way, came out in 1948. So the development of the 45 and the LP using vinyl as a medium came out in around 1948, thereabouts. So a newer history. But again, the role of recorded music is very important to this class. The role of radio is hugely important. So radio transmitted through the airwaves. We all know what radio is, but I want you to keep in mind in this class that up until we get to the 60s, the second half of the 60s, all radio that we're talking about is AM radio. There really was no FM radio. And AM radio, depending on how it was broadcast, it would be transmitted different during the day and at night. So during the day, it would be transmitted terrestrially, like across the land, and it would go from antennas through repeaters, and it had a certain range that it could reach. When you're dealing with when it was transmitted in the evenings, it would actually be transmitted up into the atmosphere, and the signal for AM radio in the evenings could go very far. So some of these big stations in the South and on the East Coast could actually transmit multiple states away. As a result, people in places, and we'll get to this later down the line, but people in places like Jamaica and Cuba could actually hear radio from the United States coming out of the South. So it's important to understand that as well, and particularly then the role of the transistor radio. So if you think about the old days, if you think about A Christmas Story and how they would go sit around the big radio that was in the living room, in the 50s, late 40s, the development of the transistor radio came, which was a small handheld battery-powered radio, and what that did was that actually created independence for who would listen to it. So think about if you grew up, in the days like I did, and my house is actually still kind of like this, where you have a TV in the living room, everybody has to watch the same thing, the same way as with the radio. When the transistor radio came out and you could afford one, then that meant that these teenagers could listen to whatever music they wanted to listen to, and they didn't have to rely on the music that just their parents were listening to. That was going to be a big factor by the time we get to the 50s. So we have ragtime, which leads into jazz and also influences Tin Pan Alley, which is, the Great American Songbook. You're going to learn about that. You're going to learn about jazz and swing, and then you're going to learn about the blues. And the blues, when it formed, was a folk music. There's really four kinds of music. There's cultural ritual, there's art music, which we call classical. There's folk music, which is kind of best described as the music of the folks, meaning that it's just sort of the common people music. It could be used in ritual type of activities, but usually it's social music. It's dance music, it's socializing, it's entertainment music, and then there's popular music. The difference between folk and pop music is that pop music's really main goal is to make money. It's still that way today. They do overlap, they do get gray, and it becomes a big deal, especially when we talk about Bob Dylan in the 60s, and we'll get to that as well. So you're going to learn about country blues, Delta blues, classic blues, which were extremely important to the roots of American music, still to this day. And then into chapter 2, you're going to learn about urban blues, which was when blues goes electric, and you have the populations that would move, the black populations that moved from the South up into the bigger cities, places like Kansas City, Chicago, Detroit, and then they start using electric instruments, electric guitars, amplifiers, and all of that. And then we get to rhythm and blues. And rhythm and blues is basically using a blues format, which you're going to learn about in the class. This AAB format, and I'm not going to try to teach the whole class. I'm just setting the context. And then in rhythm and blues, it is what it sounds like. You've got the blues foundation, but you also have rhythm involved, which is primarily dance music. So I want you to be mindful of the role that dance music plays, swing band music, rhythm and blues, as it leads into this. Other foundational elements of that get us to rock and roll is, of course, sacred music. Music can be either sacred or secular. Sacred means religious. Secular means not religious. So sacred music would be like gospel and spirituals. And then you're going to learn about doo-wop, which blends the sacred and the secular music. And then you're going to learn about country music, because that's a big influence on leading us into rock and roll as well. And then you're going to learn about rock and roll, and you're going to learn about one of the great first really important game changers, which is Elvis Presley. And you're going to learn about the importance of the electric guitar. You're going to learn about rockabilly. You're going to learn about the doors that were open because of the impact that Elvis had. You know, there was a lot of segregation in the early part of the century, really from slavery on. We don't really see it anymore today. At least it's not forced that way. But back then, you know, you had black radio, white radio, you had black concerts, white concerts. You had the Jim Crow laws. And all of these things were big factors. And Elvis came in and blew the doors down because, in a simplified way, he was a white man that sounded black, and he was able to knock down the doors for a lot of black artists, people like Chuck Berry and Little Richard, Fats Domino. And he also opened the doors for white artists like Carl Perkins and Jerry Lee Lewis, Buddy Holly, folks like that. So that is a lot of material that you're going to go through in learning all this. And I really want you to take it all in and to think about it as you go through the week. Your assignments this week won't be so much connected to the material. That'll be more last week, looking back on what you learned this week. It's because this class moves so quickly that I have to go that way. So I know this is a long video because this is so compacted, and we're covering 5 modules. I want to at least give you an introduction and set the context for everything. You'll get all this in the book. You'll get it in the online materials, and then I want you to think about things as you get into the assignments. So I think that's really it for this week. You can always reach out to me if you have questions. Again, message me in Canvas is the best way. And I realize that I haven't asked my question for your video reply. So because we haven't really gotten into materials this week, here is my question for you. It's a 2-parter, and you have to answer both parts to get the points. Part 1. He's got these hot summer days. What's your favorite summer drink? And then part 2 is, what's your favorite summer jam, like your favorite summer song? Now you have to reply in one reply. You can't do one and then another. It won't count. They've got to both be answered in the same reply. I hope that's clear. I put them right next to each other so that you would do that. So in your one reply, favorite summer drink, favorite summer jam. That's it. Have a great week. Reach out. Remember that your initial discussion post will be due on Thursday. Your reply to this is due on Thursday at noon. I think that's all. Keep cool out there. Let's have a great semester, 4-week class, and keep in touch. We'll talk soon.